Has now started. This webinar will be about policy checklists, and this morning you were sent a copy of the document we'll be reviewing. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat and we'll review them at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the mic over to Cheryl Parker. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning. Thanks, Alice. Good morning. You may still be feeling giddy with excitement from the annual kickoff when you met your new best friend, the revised monitoring tool. Well, hold on to your hats because today you're meeting your new best friend's baby brothers and sisters, the policy and procedures checklist. Living the dream, huh? Keep in mind here, we are discussing only the policy and procedure checklist. We are not addressing actual policies nor procedures. So why checklists? As you know, in the guidelines and policies, there are references regarding what agencies must do. They are legion. And these must-do items should be in your policy and procedures. So everybody on your staff and at the division knows who is doing what, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, procedures. Advisors have thoroughly reviewed the guidelines and policies to create in one place a checklist of those must-do items. Ergo, your new best friends, baby brothers and sisters, your policy and procedures checklists. There is nothing new here. No additional requirements. These checklist items have been in the guidelines and policies since Hector was a pup. So don't tattle on yourself by thinking there are more details required this year. Nuh-uh. These details should have been in your policy and procedures all along. Advisors will use these policy and procedures checklists when reviewing your policies and procedures. You are not required to use the checklist. The question would be, though, why not? Let's look at an overview. I won't read out loud all the points. I will call attention to a few, starting with the second item, clearly describe agency procedures. Do not merely quote Division of Adult Education guidelines such as activities meet requirements in the guidelines. I'll also point out the fourth item, procedures must describe who, what, when, and how. And the final item on this page, please, we recommend to the extent possible that you use the checklist order when organizing your policies. By the way, using the active voice when writing makes it more clear than the passive voice. For example, instructors hand to data entry staff the daily student attendance sign-in sheets rather than attendance records are collected. One final thought on the overview. From your policy and procedures, could a new staff member understand what they're supposed to do? Let's consider your data policy and procedures checklist. I'll point out the second one. Describe data collection, include information for remote and in person, if different. And one more for those of you who have subgrantees. The sixth one, subgrantee, follows main grantee policy or has its own policy, and the main grantee has approved it. Note here, the main grantee must acknowledge, review, and approval of subgrantees' policies and procedures when the subgrantee writes its own policy and procedures, or not applicable, of course, if you don't have subgrantees. Moving right along, next is access, intake, and orientation. I'll point out here the fifth topic, that last entry describes how the following is covered in orientation, other agency-specific information. You may have had a lot more requirements recently, such as all staff and students must wear masks inside the building, or maybe you ask students to sign acknowledgement that they have received and reviewed the student handbook or their assessment scores, for example. Not required, of course, but if your agency has specific expectations, those should be in the policy and procedures. Continuing, Mary will walk you through the next checklist. Mary, on to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone. So in lieu with Cheryl's procedure of talking about the checklist, I am only going to point out specific items. First up is the attendance policy checklist. So just to point out again about subgrantees, you want to make sure if the subgrantee is following the main grantee policy or attendance policy has been developed by the subgrantee and it has been approved. Of course, if you do not have a subgrantee, this does not apply to you. The next item is describe how many absences are allowable. This needs to be included in this policy to ensure that next steps or what next steps are taken to address excessive absences. The next item I will discuss is describe universal protocols that staff follow for students who are not meeting the obligations of the attendance policy. All staff should be following the same protocols and not have individual policies. Having silo policies can cause confusion among learners and possibly discrepancies in your attendance data. Further down the list, there's describe procedures, include information for remote and in person, if different, for how attendance will be collected, documented, and tracked for all types of classes. That includes your fully in-person, fully remote, hybrid, and or high flex. Agencies must ensure that attendance is appropriately and adequately collected, documented, and tracked for all class types offered. Full description of procedures for each class type is required. So for example, what are your procedures for collecting attendance related to fully remote classes? Does the agency use Zoom usage reports from each class session to collect and track attendance? And if so, how are those reports used to ensure adequate documentation of class attendance? And finally, on this checklist, if you bring your attention to the table, which has the fields of attendance submitted to the Data Quality Specialist or DQS, as well as attendance entered into eData. So information of the flow of who, when, and how attendance is submitted to the DQS from appropriate staff, as well as how, who, when, and how attendance is entered into eData in accordance with PDE policy. And for the final checklist that we'll discuss today, it is the assessment policy checklist. And again, just pointing out a few items here. The third item down, describe assessment administrator training. So this includes all training for those staff who are administering the state-approved formal assessments. This is very essential so that it is ensured that only trained staff are proctoring these assessments, and they are also completing the required trainings within the appropriate timeframes, as well as any refresher course required, whether that is paper-based assessments, remote assessments, or digital assessments. Moving on to the next item I would like to point out, subgrantee. Again, making sure if your subgrantee, where applicable, is following the May grantee assessment policy, or they have their own policy and it has been approved. Moving on to the next item, describe assessment administration, which includes in-person procedures, remote procedures, as well as accommodations. So you want to ensure that you have complete and concise description of how the administration of these different types of assessments are done. Again, only qualified staff, trained staff should be proctoring these particular assessments, and ensuring that you are following accommodations per publisher's suggested accommodations. And lastly, describe details of data collection. This includes storage of assessment results, as well as data review and entry. Details for data collection should be clear and concise. Policy should explain where results of the assessments are stored, whether it is electronically, whether it is hard copy and filed in a particular office with particular staff. And in addition to reviewing of these results, who and how are these assessments results reviewed for accuracy prior to entering the results into eData? And when does this review take place? And so that is it for me. I am going to turn it back over to Alice for wrap up.
Okay, sounds good. So, so far, I don't see any questions in the chat. Are there any questions at this time? I'm going to give you a moment just in case somebody is writing something.
Alice,
Yes.
can we ask questions? This is Mary
You
Mingle.
certainly may. Hi, Mary, please do.
Okay, so I noticed, and I'm very aware of the fact that these need to be easy to read, especially for you guys as well as new staff.
Sure.
What are your, when I write a description with complete sentences and paragraphs, it becomes harder and harder to read. Are we allowed to use step-by-step procedures, bulleted lists, things like that when we get to the procedure part?
Absolutely. So, when we're thinking about how to put these together, this is truly the checklist that we use when we look at yours. The way that you put it together is absolutely how you do it at your agency. I guess the biggest reason that we've put the checklist together is that sometimes finding all the details can be quite difficult. So I would ask that as you're putting it together with bullet points or steps or however works for you, just when you get to the end, if you could just do a quick check and see, is everything in there? But your style is your style.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Mary and Cheryl, anything to add to that?
No, you perfectly said it. Just making sure the content is there in whatever format is most appropriate for you. Totally fine.
And you may remember from the Data Policy Institute that we did a few years ago, we showed examples of a flow chart, for example, which was always helpful. And you may certainly include a flow chart as well into that, which, as both Mary and Alice have alluded to, is kind of a step-by-step procedure format.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute. Any questions? Okay, well, you can see from the slide that just a reminder, the deadline is Monday, October 3rd. So you've got, what, 4 weeks to review this. And of course, if you have questions, you can always contact your advisor, though honestly, it's a checklist. It's pretty straightforward. But of course, if you have any questions, please feel free. Mary or Cheryl, anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think we're good to go on that.
Okay. And Mary?
I concur.
Okay, fabulous. Well, please note that the next webinar will be October 13th. And I know it's going to be very upsetting to you, but that's all we have for today. So if you have any questions, of course, contact your advisor, and thanks so much for your time. Have a great day. I will stop the recording now. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Have a great day.